A micro story and a macro story. I'm going to focus on his micro story first, his story of how wealth gets created at the micro level under capitalism, and then I will link this to his macro story. In brief, the particular players at the micro level confront certain incentives to behave in certain ways, and the byproduct of their actions is the macro result which nobody understands or intends. Some preliminaries about important concepts that are used to spell out Marx's micro-story of capitalism. Remember that we said in the first lecture on Marx that Marx was an Enlightenment thinker, and as such he was motivated by the idea of individual freedom as the highest good, and he was basing politics on scientific principles rather than appeals to custom, natural law, religion, or tradition. So I want to start by recapitulating Marx's ideas about freedom. This is captured in a famous passage that he wrote actually at a relatively young age in his critique of the Hegelians and their followers, Feuerbach in particular, in a work called the German Ideology. There he has this very vivid description of what he means by unfreedom. He says, "The division of labor offers us the first example of how, as long as man remains in natural society, that is, as long as a cleavage exists between the particular and the common interests, as long, therefore, as activity is not voluntary but naturally divided, man's own deed becomes an alien power opposed to him, which enslaves him instead of being controlled by him. For as soon as the division of labor comes into being, Marx says, each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, or a critical critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. While in communist society, this is Marx's utopian ideal, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today, another tomorrow." This is perhaps the most famous line in Marx. To hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. This is the utopian Marx, where he talks about the idea that as soon as you have a division of labor, we are no longer free. We are enslaved to our particular place in the division of labor. Remember Adam Smith's description of the pin factory? Somebody spends their whole life stretching a wire for the pin. Somebody spends their whole life putting the heads on the pin. That's the sense in which Marx wants to say we are alienated from our true selves once the division of labor sets in, and we can only return to being fully rounded human beings at one with ourselves when the division of labor ultimately is abolished. And a precondition for that is the superabundance of wealth that capitalism is historically destined to create. In all of this, it's worth noting that Marx's basic idea is freedom, not equality. His argument is going to be that the condition for the free development of each is the free development of all. The other commitment that Marx has as an Enlightenment thinker is towards a scientific theory of politics. Marx believes that there are forces operating in history, which, remember, he calls the materialist conception of history. These forces shape the way in which history unfolds. According to him, history has a direction. It's moving through a variety of phases, each of which has internal contradictions, and the way they play themselves out is going to determine what happens. So remember, the materialistic conception of history is basically the idea that history goes into a direction. Even if history goes into zigzag, fits and starts, it has an ultimate goal, as it were. So the tension in a feudal society between the peasants and the lords is going to determine the way in which conflict in that society occurs. Then you'll get the emergence of a bourgeoisie class, and they will create capitalism, but that will bring forth a working class who will get into conflict with the bourgeoisie, and as those conflicts play out, you'll eventually get socialism and communism. Marx's scientific theory of politics is also a reductionist theory. Most of what happens for Marx is not of importance to politics, but rather what is important to politics is determined by economic interests. Whether people understand this or not, or agree with it or not, is besides the point. This brings us to another important distinction for Marx's conception of politics, namely the distinction between a class in itself and a class for itself. I will first tell you about his definition of class, and then I'll focus on the in itself versus for itself distinction. A lot of people say that Marx is anti-individualist or anti-individual. He's supposed to be an anti-individualist because he thinks about things in terms of classes and class conflict. But that turns out to be a very superficial reading of Marx. As John Elster pointed out, an eminent scholar of Marx, actually Marx is an individualist because if you look at how he defines classes, he defines them by reference to the way in which individuals relate to the means of production. So, what is it that makes you working class as opposed to a member of a capitalist class? What makes you working class is if you have to sell your labor power to somebody else in order to live. So, if you want to know whether somebody is working class, you say, does she have to sell her labor power to somebody else in order to live or not? If the answer is yes, she's working class. If the answer is no, she's not working class. You might say, well, I have come here and work every day to get paid my salary. I have to sell my labor to the university in my case, but I'm not working class. Somebody else might tell me I'm working class, but they can speak for themselves. I am not working class. Marx's answer is to appeal to the distinction between class in itself and class for itself. The answer would be something like, you're kidding yourself. You might think you're not working class, but that's because you don't understand the objective realist position in the division of labor. You are working class whether you understand it or not. So the in itself represents the objective definition of class, while for itself is the subjective definition of class, namely whether people actually believe they're working class and perceive themselves to be working class. But what matters for the movement of history is the in itself. What's ultimately going to drive everything is the objective logic of class conflict, not the subjective logic of what people think is their position in the social division of labor. That's why it's important to keep the two concepts apart. Marx ultimately wants to say that what differentiates a communist revolution from all previous revolutions is that these two things, class in itself and class for itself, will become synonymous. For the first time in history, he believes, the working class for itself will come to see itself as the working class in itself. The working class will understand their objective position in the division of labor and self-consciously create a new order. Whereas in all previous modes of production, people don't really understand their position in the objective scheme of things. They create orders as byproducts of their intended activities, not as products of their intentional design. Now, you might listen to all of this and say, well, it's kind of an odd idea. It doesn't have much to do with the way people live in the world today. After all, many people who work for wages also have money in the stock market. And so then they are capitalists, aren't they? What Marx would say about that is a bit more complicated. He would say, well, the definition of working class is that you have to work for somebody else in order to live, not that you choose to work for somebody else. So, if I have enough money invested in the stock market that I can quit tomorrow and do just fine, I'm not working class. The element of compulsion is what makes someone working class. So, for Marx, it's not important that some of us might own stocks in the market. But if we really own enough stock in the market that we are not in the position of having to work for somebody else in order to live, we wouldn't be working class. So people could move in and out of the working class.